The hallway was silent, except for the distant echo of footsteps that faded into the cold marble. She huddled against the wall, her face buried in her hands, trying to stifle her sobs so no one would notice the shame consuming her. Outside, winter was raging in New York, but nothing compared to the storm she felt inside. A public humiliation, cruel and calculated, had just ripped away what little dignity she had left. People hurried past, averting their eyes as if their pain were contagious. Until suddenly a tall, imposing shadow stopped in front of her. Without a word, the man took a white linen handkerchief from his pocket, leaned over, and with his fingertips wiped away the tears streaming from her eyes. A gesture as unlikely as it was dangerous, because this man wasn't just a stranger. He was the most feared millionaire in the city. His touch lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make her heart race as if she'd heard a silent confession. Before she could understand why, he pulled away, leaving the subtle, striking scent that seemed to engrave his name in her memory. No words were spoken, but there was something in his eyes, an ancient weight, a hidden secret, and perhaps a promise that should never be made. That night, she didn't know that the simple act of accepting that handkerchief would be the first step in a chain of events that would push her to the brink of love and ruin, and that, in the end, fate would exact a price so high, no amount of money could pay. If this story has already captivated you, you'll want to listen to the end. Like the video and subscribe to the channel right now. That morning, the sky over Manhattan was the heavy color of lead, as if the city itself foresaw that something irrevocable was about to happen. She hurried down the sidewalk, clutching the leather briefcase that seemed to grow heavier with each step. It wasn't the cold that made her shiver, but the fresh memory of what had happened hours earlier in the glass-enclosed room on the top floor, faced with judgmental gazes and smiles that relished her downfall. Cutting words, delivered with surgical precision, had stripped away not only her job, but also a fragment of her dignity. It wasn't a silent dismissal, but a public execution, shrouded in sarcasm and venomous comments about her lack of tact in dealing with important clients. The truth, however, was different, and she knew it. It had been a planned coup, a trap skillfully laid by someone who would directly benefit from her departure. As she crossed the building's cold lobby to escape that scene, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes following her, some filled with pity, others with malicious satisfaction. She tried to lift her chin, but each step sounded like walking on broken glass. As she reached the side corridor away from the cameras and security, her mask fell away. She leaned against the cold wall, her hands trembling, and let the tears flow freely, mingling with the makeup that ran mercilessly. There, in the muffled silence of that forgotten space, she wasn't the impeccable professional, nor the woman who had always known how to hide her wounds. She was simply someone who had lost everything in a matter of minutes. But what she didn't know was that, as she crumbled to pieces in that corridor, slow, steady footsteps were approaching. Footsteps that didn't belong to a curious colleague or a random stranger. They were the footsteps of someone who carried both power and secrets, and who, for reasons she couldn't yet fathom, was about to intertwine her fate with hers in a way that would change everything. The man stood before her with the serenity of someone accustomed to controlling rooms full of powerful people. But there was something different in his gaze at that moment, as if he saw beyond the shattered image she presented. He was Ethan Cole, a name that circulated in the financial columns and in gala ballrooms with equal frequency, a millionaire whose reputation oscillated between ruthless business genius and cold predator, capable of destroying empires with a phone call. He wasn't the type of man to approach strangers, much less to offer comfort, and yet there he was, kneeling lightly to reach her face. His hand held the handkerchief firmly, but the touch on her fingers was almost imperceptible, as if he feared breaking her further. She stared at him for a second, confused, trying to decipher if his gesture was an act of genuine humanity or part of a game whose rules she didn't yet know. He didn't say his name, didn't ask hers, just maintained that dense silence that said more than any sentence could. As he walked away, Ethan turned slowly, walking toward the elevator, leaving her with the strange feeling that she had been truly seen for the first time in a long time. But along with this feeling came another, more dangerous one. That brief exchange had ignited something she couldn't extinguish. And there was one detail that didn't escape her. He wasn't there by chance. His office wasn't in that building, and his presence on that floor at that exact moment couldn't be a coincidence. As she tried to catch her breath, flashes of the recent past began to align. The lost contract to a shell company, the sudden hostility from her boss, the judgmental looks. Everything became more unsettling when she remembered that, a few months ago, she had turned down a tempting but morally questionable offer made by an intermediary who never revealed the name of the real bidder. Now staring at the imposing figure disappearing behind the steel doors, she felt the uneasy weight of suspicion. What if Ethan Cole was the invisible root of everything that had happened? Her heart wanted to believe the man who offered her a handkerchief, but her reason screamed that every gesture of kindness has a price, and that, she sensed, would be exacted with interest her soul might not be able to pay. The next night, the city seemed like a stage, lit by millions of tiny lights, but for her, every street was a narrow corridor where memories and questions collided. She couldn't shake his image from her mind. The scarf, the silence, the gaze that seemed to pierce invisible defenses. She tried to convince herself that their encounter had been a coincidence, but a part of her, perhaps the most instinctive, knew she was wrong. This confirmation came as unexpectedly as it was disturbing. At the cafe where she usually took refuge to try to reorganize her life, a waiter approached with a discreet envelope with no return address. Inside, only a card with firm handwriting. "Accept my help, E.C." Her heart pounded, torn between fear and curiosity. Ethan Cole wasn't the kind of man who sent messages. He acted. And if he had taken this initiative, it was because he wanted her to know he was in control. Over the next few days, encounters began to emerge that were too subtle to be coincidence. Him at the same restaurant she was at with a friend, crossing paths with her at the entrance to a building where she had an interview, a black car parked near her street that disappeared as soon as she tried to approach. These moments, always marked by quick glances and indecipherable expressions, created an almost physical tension, as if an invisible thread connected them, and each appearance of his drew her closer. But there was something that disturbed her more than his presence, the lack of explanation. Ethan wouldn't say why he was there nor what he wanted from her. He seemed to test her limits, gauging her reactions, observing how she moved when she felt she was being watched. And little by little, what could have been just a series of coincidences began to take the form of an elaborate game, where every step she took seemed already calculated by him. The dilemma grew. Should she give in to the dangerous attraction and fascination he provoked, or should she pull away before it was too late? But how could she walk away from someone who seemed to know exactly where to find her? And worse, how could she make her feel that life without him would be nothing more than a colorless echo? The third time she saw him up close, there were no disguises, no calculated appearances from a distance. Ethan was waiting for her, sitting alone at a secluded table in an Upper East Side restaurant, as if he'd bought the right to occupy that space until she arrived. The waiter led her to him without asking, as if he already knew the meeting was set, and that made her realize that even without responding to the invitation that was never formalized, she had already agreed to be there. The background music was low, and the most present sound was the crystal glasses clinking softly on the surrounding tables. Ethan didn't stand to greet her, but his eyes held hers, as if telling her that everything else had faded. With the calm of someone who dictates the pace of the conversation before even speaking, he slid a black envelope toward her. Inside was a contract. It wasn't an ordinary job, but a proposal that sounded like salvation, a consulting position at a newly formed investment firm with a salary far above what she'd ever earned. No explicit demands, no absurd clauses on the paper. But she sensed the true content wasn't written. Ethan didn't explain the reason for the offer, only that he believed in her talent and that the world had been unfair to her. And every word he said seemed to touch the raw wound she'd carried since the humiliation at her former company. Most disturbing, however, was the way he spoke of restoring balance and righting wrongs, as if it weren't just about work, but about revenge. She knew accepting might mean entering a terrain where morality wouldn't survive intact, but the idea of regaining what she'd lost, and perhaps more, pulsed like an almost irresistible temptation. As her fingers touched the edge of the contract, Ethan smiled almost imperceptibly, as if he already knew what her answer would be. And in that instant, she began to wonder if that encounter was truly a choice, or just another calculated step on a path he had designed long before she realized she was on it. Accepting the offer was like walking through a door that could no longer be closed. On her first day, she arrived at the indicated address and discovered that the new company occupied an entire floor of a luxurious building, but with an incomplete air, as if every detail had been hastily assembled for a very specific function. A few employees, all extremely discreet, greeted with a minimal nod and returned to their monitors without curiosity. Ethan received her in the center of a room with windows that revealed the entire city at her feet. There was no formality, just a brief instruction. Here you'll work directly with me. And so it was. The tasks were too simple for the salary, but they carried confidential information, documents that revealed deals involving powerful names, hidden investments and decisions that could destroy reputations. He wasn't asking her to do anything illegal, yet. But each day made it clearer that the work was a curtain, a carefully constructed stage to keep her close to him, and she, even suspicious, couldn't deny the fascination that grew with each interaction. Ethan rarely touched her, but when he did, a simple touch on the shoulder during an explanation was enough to leave her breathless. His intense, calculated gaze seemed to measure every reaction, as if studying a work of art that only he fully understood. As the weeks passed, he began including her in closed meetings where she witnessed alliances formed based on veiled threats and tempting promises. She realized that Ethan didn't just control companies, he controlled people, turning favors into unpayable debts. And little by little, she understood that she was being molded into a part of this game, perhaps even its most valuable asset. Still, there was a part of her that silently sensed that accepting this role might not only be dangerous but irreversible, and deep down something whispered that when the price was exacted, it wouldn't be in dollars. The first mission arrived on a rainy morning when the windows were covered in droplets that distorted the horizon as if the world outside were just a painting about to crumble. Ethan entered her office without knocking, placing a leather briefcase on the table with the precision of someone positioning a decisive piece on a chessboard. "I need you to go to this address and deliver this in person. Don't trust anyone to do it for you," he said, with a calmness that belied the weight implicit in those words. She opened the briefcase and found documents that, at a cursory glance, revealed secrets capable of sinking an international conglomerate, forged contracts, account records in tax havens, and even private correspondence linking influential politicians to illicit dealings. It wasn't just confidential, it was dangerous. Ethan didn't explain how the papers had been obtained, nor why they needed to be delivered, but his look made it clear that refusal was not an option. As she left to complete her task, she felt the cold wind cut through her skin, as if the weather itself knew that this step would forever alter her life. On the way, she noticed she was being followed. A black car kept its distance, but never disappeared from her rearview mirror. Her heart raced, and at every turn, the world seemed to narrow. When she finally reached the indicated building, a luxury penthouse on Fifth Avenue, she was greeted by a man in an impeccable suit and an impenetrable expression. He took the folder without asking questions, but his eyes scanned her as if memorizing every feature of her face. On the way back, the black car no longer followed her, but the silence of the city sounded different, as if she were now part of something much larger and much darker than she had ever imagined. When she returned, Ethan was waiting, sitting as if knowing every step she had taken, every second she hesitated. "I see you made it," he said, unsmiling. But deep in his voice, there was a hint of satisfaction and something else, something that sounded dangerously like possession. Over the next few days, The feeling of being watched went from paranoia to almost a physical presence. At first, it was just subtle details, an anonymous phone call that hung up as soon as she answered, the same blonde woman, sitting 2 tables away in a different cafe every morning, a taxi driver who seemed to recognize her name before she even said it. Then came the more daring coincidences. She found flowers on the table in her apartment that she hadn't ordered, accompanied by unsigned cards with messages that felt like veiled reminders that Ethan knew exactly where she slept, what she ate, who she talked to. One night, when she opened the door, she found the white handkerchief, the same one he'd used to wipe her. Tears in the hallway weeks before, neatly folded on the kitchen counter. There was no way he had a key, or maybe he did. It was as if her every move were under surveillance, as if life had lost its place in chance. Outside of work, he never acknowledged his presence, but the evidence of his influence appeared like invisible marks on her skin. And despite her fear, there was a side of her that felt protected, almost desired, as if she were the centerpiece of a puzzle he wasn't ready to reveal. Gradually, she realized that even her most intimate conversations, with friends or family, returned to her through phrases and observations Ethan would drop casually, but which proved he had access to everything. There was no doubt. She was being tested, pushed to an emotional limit known only to him. And in the silence of this game, the feeling grew that by the time he decided to show his cards, she would be so involved that she would no longer have the strength or the will to leave. Power came, disguised as confidence. Ethan entered her office with a restrained smile, as if bearing a rare gift, and placed a small, elegant silver flash drive on the table, reflecting the light as if it held something too precious to be trivial. "Today, you will decide someone's fate," he said, leaning back in his chair with an almost carefree air, but with eyes that watched her every reaction. Connecting the device to the computer, he found a single password-protected folder. Ethan entered the combination without hesitation, and then the screen filled with compromising documents, emails, bank statements, photos that should never exist in the wrong hands. The person at the center of it all was a renowned executive, known for his public charisma and ironically for championing social causes. But what was inside completely shattered that image: embezzlement of funds, blackmail, secret relationships with political figures, and even evidence of bid rigging. Ethan explained that all it took was one click to send all the material to independent journalists, who would ensure full exposure of the scandal. Or if she preferred, she could delete everything, burying the truth forever. What he didn't say, but was clear in the enigmatic gleam in his eyes, was that this decision wasn't just about the executive, but about herself. Accepting that power would also mean accepting the weight and consequences of what would come next. She remained silent, her finger hovering over the mouse, feeling that any choice would draw her deeper into his world. And somewhere between fear and excitement, a part of her wondered if Ethan really wanted her to choose, or if everything had already been decided long before that moment. The next day, the city seemed to wake up noisier, as if the air carried murmurs that traveled from newspaper to newspaper, from screen to screen, from mouth to mouth. The decision she had made, a simple click in the solitude of that room, was already transforming into headlines and heated debates on social media. The executive, once seen as untouchable, now had his face plastered across the front pages of major newspapers, not as an admired leader, but as a public traitor. The evidence was devastating, and his downfall was so swift it seemed staged. But what disturbed her most was not the media reaction, but rather the invisible consequences that began to emerge in the following days. An employee of his company, whom she had never met, appeared on television in tears, saying she had lost her job because of the scandal. A small supplier closed its doors, unable to survive the breach of contracts the affair had caused. And on a random street corner, a man who seemed a stranger glared at her with hatred, muttering something she didn't understand, but that sounded dangerously like an accusation. Ethan, however, seemed pleased. Seeing her uneasy, he leaned closer and said, almost in a whisper, "Power always has a price. The difference is that now you know how to use it." These words echoed within her, mixing pride and guilt in doses that made her uneasy. She began to notice that some doors that had previously been closed now opened easily. Invitations to exclusive events, influential people who treated her with deference, offers that came with ulterior motives. It was as if she had suddenly been accepted into a restricted circle, but at the cost of something she could not recover. And although she tried to convince herself that she had done what she had to do to survive, deep down she knew the line between justice and revenge was growing ever thinner. The invitation arrived in a heavy black envelope, with her name handwritten in gold ink. The paper had the subtle scent of something too expensive to throw away. Ethan didn't elaborate, only saying that she should be ready by 8 o'clock in the evening, wearing a dress that said more than she was willing to reveal. By the time the limousine dropped her off in front of the hotel, the spotlights were already cutting through the Manhattan night like blades of light, and the red carpet was packed with photographers, journalists, and guests dressed as if they belonged to a world rarely soiled by the dust of reality. Ethan appeared at her side just as she began to feel out of place, impeccable in a tailored tuxedo, with that calculated look that seemed to predict her every move. They entered the ballroom together, where the sound of glasses mingled with rehearsed laughter and conversations worth millions of dollars. But it didn't take long for her to realize she wasn't there simply as a companion. She was part of a spectacle, an element of a silent narrative that Ethan wanted everyone to see. Between introductions and strategic smiles, he began to mention her subtly, hinting at her importance in recent decisions without ever stating exactly what her role was. This aroused curiosity and jealousy in those present. It was then that, in the midst of a toast, an influential businessman approached, making ironic comments about the miracle that had brought down the corrupt executive. It was a public challenge, a trap to gauge her reaction. Ethan didn't intervene, watching her like a director intent on the most important scene in a film. And in that moment she understood, this event was a test. Every word, every look, every gesture she made that night would be recorded and interpreted by people who had the power to open or close paths. The game was no longer just between her and Ethan. Now she was before an invisible tribunal, and any slip-up could cost more than her reputation. Backstage, away from the cameras and the elegant hubbub, the air seemed thick with hushed conversations and quick glances that said more than any words. As she followed Ethan down a narrow hallway, she realized that the real party was happening there, not with music or toasts, but with cold negotiations and promises sealed with discreet handshakes. People who had smiled at her minutes before now revealed themselves in sharp whispers, exchanging information that reeked of blackmail and decades-old secrets. It was in this setting that a tall woman in an emerald green dress and a sharp smile approached with a glass of champagne and a phrase that made her freeze. "You know you're in someone else's place, don't you?" Before she could respond, the woman walked away, leaving a strong scent in the air, doubt throbbing like a freshly opened wound. Ethan, who had watched the scene from afar, approached and instead of comforting her said in a low, firm voice, "People only attack those who matter. If you react, you lose. If you ignore, you win." The lesson sounded like advice, but deep down it was a reminder that she was now in territory where weakness was not forgiven. Throughout the evening, she noticed other looks, some curious, others pure calculation, and the certainty that every smile she received had a price attached. Before they left, Ethan was called away for a private conversation with two men who exuded authority, leaving her alone for a few minutes. During that time, a waiter discreetly handed her a note. "He's not who you think, and you're not the first." When Ethan returned, he didn't ask any questions, as if knowing the contents of that note would haunt her long after that evening. She didn't sleep that night. The note burned in her hand as if written with fire, and the phrase echoed in her mind until dawn. When the sun finally broke the horizon, she decided to discover for herself who Ethan Cole really was, and what had happened to the others who, according to the note, came before her. She began with public records, combing through old news reports, appearances at events and sudden changes in companies linked to his name. At first, everything seemed impeccable, a resume of victories and prestige. But digging deeper, she found traces of buried stories, women who appeared alongside him in photos and disappeared months later without explanation. Some moved to other countries, others became embroiled in scandals that destroyed their careers. In obscure forums and nearly erased news stories, she noticed a pattern of silent destruction that always left Ethan intact and more powerful. Determined to go further, she sought out one of these women. After days of searching, she managed to find Claire, a former consultant for one of her companies, living in seclusion in the countryside. The meeting was tense, but when he mentioned his name, Claire froze as if a ghost had entered the room. "He knows where I am," she said, her voice trembling. "He always knows." Between silences and glances at the window, Claire revealed that, at first, Ethan seemed like a savior, a protector, someone who restored dignity. But little by little, the relationship became a web of emotional debts and favors, impossible to deny. Until one day, he confronted the person with a choice that destroyed them. And, whatever the decision, they ended up alone, scarred, and with no way out. Hearing that, her stomach churned, because she felt that same trap closing in on her. On the way home, every shadow on the street seemed darker, every unfamiliar face more menacing. When he entered the apartment, he found a single red rose on the table and, beside it, the white handkerchief. It was clean and neatly folded, but with one unusual detail. In the center of the fabric was a small red stain, too fresh to be mere wine. That night she realized there was no longer a line between choice and destiny. The rose and the handkerchief on the table weren't just calculated gestures. They were a warning. Ethan was telling her, without words, that he knew exactly where she'd been, who she'd talked to, and even what she'd learned. The sound of the rain against the window seemed to amplify the dense silence of the apartment. She sat, clutching the handkerchief tightly, as if that scrap of fabric could reveal what he truly wanted. The phone rang. The display showed no number, just a black screen. When she answered, she heard his voice, calm and heavy with a sentence-like weight. "You sought answers. Now you'll have to deal with them." Before she could respond, the call dropped. Seconds later, she received an email with no sender, containing a single file. Photos of her delivering the folder of documents weeks ago, from angles that proved every step had been recorded. At the bottom, an image of Claire, alone, looking out the window, and another of herself captured in the hallway on the first day they met, her eyes swollen from tears. The underlying message was cruelly clear. To him, she was nothing more than another chapter in a repeated story, controlled down to the last detail. But what Ethan didn't know was that while he was watching her, she had also learned to observe. She had kept copies of the contracts, transactions, and compromising conversations, not out of obedience, but out of survival. Instinct. And that night, without hesitation, she sent everything to an anonymous contact at an investigative newspaper. The next day, headlines carried not just the name of Ethan's next enemy, but his own. Scandals, fraud, blackmail, manipulation, all exposed in detail, with evidence that left no room for defense. He wasn't arrested immediately, but his downfall began there, in the public square, like an empire crumbling brick by brick. She, in turn, left New York before the counterattack came. She carried only a suitcase, silence as a shield, and the white handkerchief in her pocket, now with the dried red stain, a reminder that the power he had used to control could also be the blade that destroyed him. And as the train crossed the state line, she understood the lesson Karma had been telling her. There's no such thing as absolute control. Those who make a living manipulating fate inevitably find someone willing to turn the tables, and this time, the checkmate was hers. If this story touched you, just imagine what's coming next. Like now, subscribe, and activate the bell, because in the next video, I'll reveal an even darker case where revenge doesn't wait for dawn.